Welcome to Betrayed Hearts Chronicles. The flash of cameras outside the hotel ballroom was relentless, their blinding glare slicing through the evening air. Eleanor Foster adjusted the strap of her designer gown, her practiced smile fixed in place as she stood by her husband, Senator Richard Foster. At 50, Richard exuded the charisma of a seasoned politician, his salt and pepper hair lending him an air of authority that voters adored. Eleanor, however, felt like an accessory, a polished trophy to complete the picture-perfect image of a successful candidate. As Richard greeted another donor, Eleanor's attention wandered to the bustling campaign staff setting up for his keynote address. That's when she noticed him. A tall, sharply dressed man with an easy confidence that seemed to draw people to him. He was standing at the edge of the room, a tablet in hand, his dark eyes scanning the crowd like he was assessing every detail. His presence was magnetic, and Eleanor found herself unable to look away. The man caught her staring and smiled. A slow, knowing grin that sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. He approached, weaving through the crowd with practiced ease, and extended his hand. "Mrs. Foster," he said, his voice smooth and warm. "Liam Harper, campaign manager." Eleanor shook his hand, his grip firm but not overbearing. "Ah, so you're the one running the show behind the scenes." Liam chuckled. "Something like that. It's a pleasure to finally meet you. The senator speaks highly of you." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Does he now? That's news to me." Liam's smile widened, and he leaned in slightly. "You're the backbone of his campaign, even if he doesn't always say it. I've seen how the room lights up when you're around." Eleanor's cheeks flushed, a reaction she hadn't experienced in years. She quickly regained her composure, offering a polite laugh. "Well, I try to be supportive." Before the conversation could go further, Richard reappeared, clapping a hand on Liam's shoulder. "Ah, Liam," Richard said, his voice booming with practiced enthusiasm. "I see you've met Eleanor. Isn't she remarkable?" "Absolutely," Liam replied, his gaze flicking back to Eleanor for a brief moment. Richard's attention was quickly pulled elsewhere, and as he moved off to greet another guest, Liam lingered for a second longer. "Good luck tonight," he said to Eleanor, his tone carrying a hint of something unspoken. She watched him walk away, a strange mixture of intrigue and unease settling over her. Later that night, as the ballroom emptied and the applause for Richard's speech faded into echoes, Eleanor found herself wandering into the campaign's temporary office space. The room was dimly lit, filled with the quiet hum of electronics and the faint scent of coffee. Liam was there, seated at a desk, his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up. He looked up as she entered, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. Eleanor hesitated before stepping inside. "I needed some air. I didn't mean to interrupt." "You're not," Liam said, gesturing to the seat across from him. "Care to join me?" Eleanor hesitated but eventually sat down, smoothing her dress. "I'm curious. How do you manage all of this? The speeches, the schedules, the endless events?" Liam leaned back in his chair, his smile easy. "It's a lot of moving pieces, but I thrive on the chaos. Besides, it's worth it when you believe in the candidate." Eleanor tilted her head, studying him. "Do you believe in him?" Liam's expression shifted, becoming more serious. "He's a good man. Ambitious, sure, but he genuinely wants to make a difference." Eleanor nodded, though a part of her wondered if that same ambition had come at the cost of their marriage. "Richard is lucky to have you," Liam added, his voice softening. The words caught her off guard, their sincerity cutting through her practiced defenses. "That's kind of you to say." "It's true." Liam's gaze lingered on hers, and for a moment, the room seemed to shrink around them. Eleanor stood abruptly, the spell broken. "I should let you get back to work." "Of course," Liam said, rising as she did. "Good night, Mrs. Foster." "Good night, Liam," she replied, her pulse quickening as she left the room. As Eleanor returned to her hotel suite, her thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion. Liam's presence had stirred something in her, something she hadn't felt in years, and it scared her, The days following the fundraiser were a blur of handshakes, speeches, and tightly scheduled campaign stops. Eleanor moved through them on autopilot, her presence always required but seldom acknowledged. The nagging feeling of being an accessory to Richard's ambitions grew heavier with each passing day. And then there was Liam. Their interactions were polite, professional even, but Eleanor couldn't ignore the undercurrent of something deeper. A glance held a second too long. The brush of his hand as he passed her a folder. A quiet exchange of smiles during a lull in an event. It was during a campaign rally in a small town that the first real crack appeared in her carefully controlled exterior. Eleanor was seated near the stage, her husband delivering another rousing speech about reform and opportunity. She clapped at the right moments, smiled when the cameras swung her way, but her focus kept drifting to Liam, who stood at the edge of the crowd, clipboard in hand. As the applause erupted at the end of Richard's speech, Liam caught her eye and nodded toward the back of the venue. When the crowd began to disperse, Eleanor slipped away, finding Liam waiting near a side exit. "Everything all right?" she asked, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. "Just needed to step away from the chaos for a minute," Liam said, his expression warm. "What about you? You looked like you could use a breather." Eleanor smiled faintly. "It's a lot, isn't it? All of this." Liam leaned against the wall, his posture relaxed but his gaze intent. "It is, but you handle it well. You always look so composed." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a small smirk. "I'm sure you've seen through that by now." "Maybe," Liam admitted, his tone softening, "but I think there's more to you than most people see. More than even your husband sees." The words hung in the air, heavier than Eleanor expected. She looked away, her pulse quickening. "Liam, we shouldn't talk," he interrupted gently. "I'm just saying what I see." Eleanor shook her head, her cheeks warming. "I should get back. Richard will be looking for me." Liam straightened but didn't move out of her way. "One thing before you go." Eleanor hesitated, meeting his gaze. "What? Do you ever wonder what it's like to be seen for who you really are? Not just as the senator's wife, but as you." Her breath caught, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. Finally, she managed, "I don't think about that much." "Maybe you should," Liam said, stepping aside to let her pass. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, but Liam's words echoed in Eleanor's mind long after she returned to the hotel. Later that night, as Richard snored softly beside her, Eleanor stared at the ceiling, her thoughts racing. For years, she had accepted her role in her husband's world without question. But Liam's quiet observations had unsettled something deep within her. She told herself it was harmless, that Liam's attention was nothing more than professional courtesy. But the next morning, when she saw him standing by the campaign bus, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his smile easy, she couldn't deny the flicker of anticipation in her chest. Liam turned as if sensing her presence, his smile widening as their eyes met. And Eleanor realized, with a sinking certainty, that the boundaries she had so carefully maintained were beginning to blur. The campaign trail carried Eleanor and the team to a series of small towns, each event blending into the next. Eleanor had mastered the art of smiling through speeches and shaking hands with donors, but her thoughts increasingly strayed to Liam. Their moments alone were brief but charged, filled with an unspoken tension that neither seemed willing to address directly. And then the touches began, small, fleeting, accidental, or at least they seemed that way. One afternoon, during a quick stop at a diner for the campaign staff to grab lunch, Eleanor found herself sitting next to Liam at the counter. Richard had taken a table with a few key donors, leaving Eleanor free to linger among the team. Liam passed her a menu, his fingers brushing hers. The touch was light, barely noticeable, but it sent a jolt through Eleanor that she couldn't ignore. "Sorry," he said, his voice low, though his eyes lingered on hers for a moment too long. "It's fine," Eleanor replied, trying to steady her breathing. She turned her attention to the menu, but the sensation of his skin against hers lingered. As the group settled into their meals, Eleanor felt the heat of Liam's proximity. His arm rested casually on the counter, close enough that if she moved slightly, they'd be touching again. "You don't eat much on these trips, do you?" Liam asked, his tone light but his gaze intent. Eleanor glanced at her untouched plate and smiled faintly. "I guess I'm not used to the pace. Everything feels so rushed." "You should take a moment for yourself," Liam said softly, leaning closer. "Even just a small one. You deserve that." Eleanor's heart skipped. She glanced toward Richard, who was deep in conversation across the room, and then back at Liam. "I'll keep that in mind." Later that evening, as the team prepared for another rally, Eleanor stood backstage, adjusting her necklace in the reflection of a mirror. Liam appeared beside her, clipboard in hand. "Looks good," he said, his voice just above a whisper. Eleanor turned, startled. "What does?" "Everything," Liam said, his lips curling into a small smile. She rolled her eyes, though her pulse quickened. "Flattery won't get you far, Liam." He stepped closer, his tone shifting. "It's not flattery if it's true." Eleanor opened her mouth to reply, but the words caught in her throat as Liam reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her shoulder. His fingers lingered for the briefest moment before he pulled back, his gaze locked on hers. "Sorry," he murmured, his voice barely audible. It's fine," Eleanor said quickly, stepping back. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, and the electricity of his touch was almost unbearable. Liam held her gaze for a moment longer before stepping away, his demeanor returning to professional as if nothing had happened. But for Eleanor, everything had changed. That night, Eleanor sat alone in the quiet of her hotel room, her mind replaying the day's events. The accidental touches, the lingering glances, the way Liam's presence seemed to fill every empty space in her life. She told herself it was nothing, just a harmless flirtation, an escape from the monotony of her role. But deep down, she knew the truth. The boundaries she had once relied on were slipping away, and she wasn't sure she wanted to stop them. The campaign trail finally brought a rare evening of downtime in a bustling city. Eleanor stood by the hotel window, gazing out at the city lights below. The hum of traffic and the distant murmur of voices were a stark contrast to the usual quiet that consumed her nights. Her phone buzzed on the dresser, and she reached for it, expecting a message from Richard. Instead, it was from Liam. "There's a little jazz bar 2 blocks from here. Join me for a drink." Eleanor stared at the screen, her heart pounding. She knew what it meant, what it could mean. She glanced at the closed bathroom door, where Richard was getting ready for a late dinner meeting with donors. "Just one drink," she typed back before she could talk herself out of it. The bar was small and dimly lit, the soft strains of saxophone music filling the air. Eleanor slipped inside, her coat pulled tightly around her shoulders, scanning the room until she saw Liam at a corner table. He rose as she approached, pulling out a chair for her. "You came," he said, his voice warm. Eleanor sat, her nerves buzzing. "I didn't want to be rude." Liam smiled, signaling to the waiter. "One drink. That's all I'm asking." They ordered cocktails, and for a moment, the silence between them felt heavy. But then Liam leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, and asked, "So, Eleanor, what do you do when you're not being the perfect senator's wife?" The question caught her off guard. I don't know. It's been so long since I thought about that." Liam's expression softened. "You used to have hobbies, right? Things you loved." Eleanor hesitated, then smiled faintly. "I used to paint, before everything got so busy." Liam nodded, his gaze steady. "You should do that again." She laughed softly. "It's not that simple." "Why not?" Liam asked. "You deserve to have something that's yours, Eleanor. Something that's just for you." His words struck a chord, and Eleanor felt a lump rise in her throat. Before she could respond, the waiter returned with their drinks, breaking the moment. They sipped in comfortable silence for a while, the music weaving around them like a spell. Eleanor found herself relaxing, her usual guarded demeanor slipping away as they talked about everything and nothing. Liam had a way of drawing her out, of making her feel seen in a way she hadn't in years. When it was time to leave, Liam offered to walk her back to the hotel. The cool night air was a welcome relief from the warmth of the bar, and they strolled in companionable silence until they reached the hotel's entrance. Eleanor hesitated at the steps, turning to face him. "Thank you, Liam, for tonight. It was nice." "It was," Liam agreed, his voice soft. "I'm glad you came." For a moment, they stood there, the city noise fading into the background. Then Liam reached out, his hand brushing hers lightly. "Eleanor," he began, his tone uncertain. She should have stepped back, should have pulled away. But instead, she stayed rooted to the spot, her heart hammering in her chest. Liam leaned in, his lips brushing her cheek in a touch so light it was almost a question. Eleanor closed her eyes, her breath catching as he lingered for a moment before pulling back. "Good night, Eleanor," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Good night," she managed, watching as he turned and walked away. Eleanor climbed the steps to the hotel, her thoughts racing. She knew she was treading dangerous ground, but for the first time in years, she felt alive. And that scared her as much as it thrilled her. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of rallies, fundraisers, and strategy meetings, but Eleanor found her thoughts constantly drifting to Liam. Their late-night drink had left an imprint on her, and the memory of his quiet intensity lingered in her mind. Their interactions grew bolder, the unspoken tension between them threatening to boil over. A lingering glance, a brush of hands as he passed her a pen. The way his voice softened whenever he spoke to her, even in a room full of people. And then came the night that changed everything. The campaign team had checked into a luxurious but remote estate for a weekend retreat to prepare for the final stretch before the election. After a long day of planning sessions and speeches, Eleanor found herself unable to sleep. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floors. She stepped out onto the terrace, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. The night was cool, the sky blanketed with stars. She leaned against the railing, savoring the rare moment of solitude, when she heard footsteps behind her. "Couldn't sleep?" Liam's voice broke the silence, low and warm. Eleanor turned, her pulse quickening as she saw him standing in the doorway. He had shed his blazer, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his tie hanging loose. "Not tonight," she replied, her voice quieter than she intended. Liam stepped closer, his movements unhurried. "Too much on your mind?" Eleanor smiled faintly, looking back at the stars. "Something like that." They stood side by side for a moment, the silence between them comfortable but charged. "I've been thinking about you," Liam said softly, his words catching her off guard. Eleanor turned to him, her breath hitching. "Liam, I know," he interrupted, his gaze steady. "This is risky. It's complicated. But I can't pretend I don't feel it anymore." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, Eleanor felt as though the world had fallen away, leaving only the two of them. "Say something," Liam urged, his voice almost pleading. Eleanor took a shaky breath. I don't know what to say." Liam reached for her hand, his touch gentle but insistent. "Then don't say anything." He stepped closer, his free hand brushing her cheek. Eleanor felt her defenses crumbling, the pull between them too strong to resist. When his lips met hers, the kiss was soft at first, tentative, as though giving her the chance to stop it. But Eleanor didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into him, her hands gripping the front of his shirt as the kiss deepened. Liam's arms wrapped around her, drawing her closer as the world blurred around them. They stumbled back into the house, their movements hurried but deliberate. The flicker of logic in Eleanor's mind urged her to stop, to think, but the need coursing through her was overpowering. Liam guided her into a quiet sitting room, the moonlight streaming through the windows casting soft shadows across the room. They sank onto the couch, their hands exploring each other with a fervor neither had anticipated. "Eleanor?" Liam murmured against her neck, his voice thick with desire. She silenced him with another kiss, her body responding to his touch in a way that felt both foreign and exhilarating. Hours later, they lay tangled together on the couch, the faint glow of dawn creeping through the curtains. Eleanor rested her head on Liam's chest, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. guilt, exhilaration, and a gnawing fear of what came next. "This can't happen again," she whispered, though her words lacked conviction. Liam's fingers traced patterns on her back. "If you mean that, I'll respect it. But I don't think you do." Eleanor closed her eyes, torn between the life she had built and the connection she couldn't deny. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive. Eleanor told herself it was a one-time mistake, a lapse in judgment she would never repeat. But when she saw Liam the next morning, standing confidently with his clipboard in hand, and that knowing smile playing on his lips, her resolve wavered. Their connection had become undeniable, and soon, stolen moments turned into a routine neither of them dared to name. It began with glances across crowded rooms, subtle and unreadable to anyone but them. A text message here, a whispered word there. When the campaign schedule grew more demanding, those small exchanges gave way to stolen afternoons and carefully planned rendezvous. Eleanor found herself making excuses to leave the hotel early or skip an event entirely, her absence easily explained away by the sheer chaos of the campaign trail. Liam, ever discreet, would find a way to meet her, whether in the quiet corner of a hotel suite or the backseat of a car parked in an empty lot. Their passion was raw and consuming, a stark contrast to the carefully curated life Eleanor had lived for so long. Liam's touch made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years, and though guilt tugged at the edges of her mind, she pushed it aside. One afternoon, as the team prepared for a rally, Eleanor slipped away to the hotel room Liam had secured for them. When he arrived, his tie already loosened, she was waiting by the window, the sunlight catching the soft curls of her hair. "You're going to make me late?" Liam teased as he crossed the room, pulling her into his arms. "Then stop wasting time," Eleanor replied, her voice playful but breathless. They kissed with the urgency of two people stealing time, their movements unrestrained. As Liam's hands explored her body, Eleanor forgot about everything beyond the room. The rally, the cameras, even Richard. Afterward, as they lay tangled together on the bed, Liam ran his fingers through her hair. "You deserve more than this," he said softly. Eleanor propped herself up on one elbow, studying his face. "What do you mean?" "I mean sneaking around," Liam replied, his tone serious. "You deserve someone who can be with you out in the open." Eleanor's chest tightened. "Liam, you knew what this was when it started." "I can't." "You can," Liam interrupted gently, his hand cupping her cheek. "You're stronger than you think." She looked away, the weight of his words too heavy to confront. As the affair continued, the risks grew. Eleanor began to notice the sidelong glances from the staff, the subtle questions from Richard about her absences. Her carefully constructed world was beginning to crack, but she couldn't bring herself to stop. One evening, after a particularly heated argument with Richard about her lack of involvement in his campaign, Eleanor found herself texting Liam. "Are you free?" His response came quickly. "Always." "Where?" Eleanor gave him the address of a quiet park near the hotel. When she arrived, Liam was already waiting, leaning against a tree, his hands in his pockets. "Rough night?" he asked as she approached. Eleanor nodded, tears pricking her eyes. "I can't keep doing this, pretending everything's fine." Liam pulled her into his arms without hesitation. "You don't have to pretend with me." For the first time that evening, Eleanor felt her tension ease. She rested her head against Liam's chest, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat grounding her. But even in his arms, she couldn't shake the growing fear that their time was running out. The campaign was entering its final, grueling weeks, and the pressure on everyone was palpable. Eleanor had grown adept at concealing her affair with Liam, slipping away during lulls in the schedule, crafting excuses that seemed airtight. But the facade was beginning to show cracks, and the stakes were higher than ever. It started with subtle warnings. A longtime aide of Richard's, Judith, stopped Eleanor in the hallway of the campaign headquarters one morning, her expression unusually guarded. "Mrs. Foster," she said, lowering her voice. "Can I give you some advice?" Eleanor blinked, caught off guard. "Of course." "Be careful," Judith said, her eyes sharp. "People notice things. And in this world, Perception is everything. Eleanor felt a chill creep down her spine. I'm not sure what you mean. Judith hesitated for a fraction of a second, then smiled politely. I'm sure you don't. Just be mindful. The conversation left Eleanor unsettled. A few days later, the tension escalated. Eleanor received an unmarked envelope slipped under her hotel room door. Inside was a single photograph, grainy but unmistakable. It was of her and Liam, caught in a brief but intimate moment, his hand resting on her waist as they stood too close in the shadow of a campaign bus. Her breath caught as she stared at the image, her mind racing. Who had taken it? And what did they want? Her phone buzzed, and she flinched. The message was from an unknown number. $20,000 by the end of the week, or this goes public. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read the demand. Panic set in, her thoughts spiraling. If the photo were leaked, it would destroy Richard's campaign and shatter their family. The fallout would be catastrophic. She called Liam immediately. Someone knows, she said the moment he answered, her voice trembling. Eleanor, slow down. What are you talking about? She explained the photograph and the blackmail message. Liam's tone hardened. Where are you? He asked. In my room, Eleanor replied. I'm coming up, Liam said, his voice firm. When Liam arrived, he examined the photograph and the message, his jaw tightening. Whoever this is, they've been watching us, he said, his tone grim. We have to figure out who it is before they can do any more damage. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. What if it's someone on the staff? Or worse, what if it's Judith? She practically warned me this was coming. Liam crouched in front of her, taking her hands in his. We'll handle this. Promise. But first, we need to figure out how to respond. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. If Richard finds out. He won't, Liam said firmly. Not if we stay ahead of this. But staying ahead proved to be more difficult than they imagined. Over the next few days, Eleanor received more messages, each more threatening than the last. The blackmailer seemed to know their every move, and the pressure began to take its toll. Eleanor grew paranoid, scrutinizing every glance, every comment from the staff. She avoided Judith altogether, afraid her suspicions might spill out in a confrontation. Liam, meanwhile, tried to maintain their facade of normalcy, but the strain was evident. Their stolen moments became hurried and tense, their once passionate connection overshadowed by the looming threat. The breaking point came during a campaign event at a large gala. Eleanor was seated at a table with donors, doing her best to play the role of the supportive wife, when her phone buzzed with a new message. Time's up. Check your email. Her stomach dropped. Excusing herself, she slipped into the restroom and opened her email. Her heart sank as she saw what the blackmailer had sent. More photographs, each more incriminating than the last. The email ended with a chilling ultimatum. Deliver the money by tomorrow, or these go to every major news outlet in the country. Eleanor gripped the sink, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. She called Liam, her voice shaking. It's over, Liam. They have everything. Meet me outside, he said. Now. Eleanor slipped out of the gala, finding Liam waiting near the valet. His expression was grim as she approached. We need to pay them, she said, her voice desperate. It's the only way to stop this. Liam shook his head. You don't negotiate with people like this. If we pay, they'll just come back for more. Then what do we do? Eleanor asked, tears brimming in her eyes. We fight, Liam said, his jaw set. And we don't let them win. Eleanor wanted to believe him, but the weight of the situation was crushing. She knew the storm was coming, and no matter what they did, it would leave destruction in its wake. The morning after the gala, Eleanor woke to the sound of her phone buzzing incessantly. Disoriented, she reached for it, her heart sinking as she saw a flood of missed calls and unread messages from Richard, the campaign staff, and several unknown numbers. She sat up quickly, dread pooling in her stomach. As she unlocked her phone, the first message she opened was from Judith. Call me now. It's everywhere. Her breath hitched as she clicked the link Judith had sent. It opened to a political gossip site, the headline screaming at her in bold letters. Secret affair rocks Foster campaign. Politician's wife caught in scandal with campaign manager. The article was accompanied by photos, grainy but damning, of Eleanor and Liam in various compromising moments. Liam's hand brushing her cheek, the two of them embracing in a dark hallway, their heads close in an intimate exchange. Her blood ran cold. The blackmailer had followed through on their threat. By the time Eleanor arrived at campaign headquarters, the mood was electric with tension. Staff members whispered in corners, their gazes darting away whenever she passed. Judith intercepted her at the door to Richard's office, her expression a mixture of sympathy and exasperation. "Eleanor," she began, lowering her voice, "it's bad. Richard's furious, and the media's already outside." Eleanor swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Where is he?" Judith nodded toward the closed office door. "He's waiting for you." "But Eleanor, prepare yourself. He's not going to hold back." Summoning what little strength she had, Eleanor pushed open the door. Richard stood by the window, his back to her, his phone pressed to his ear. His voice was sharp and controlled, the way it always was when he was angry but couldn't afford to lose his temper. "She's here," he said curtly, ending the call and turning to face her. His expression was a mask of cold fury. "Richard, Eleanor started, but he cut her off. "Don't," he snapped. "Don't even try to explain." Eleanor flinched, her carefully rehearsed words evaporating. "I never wanted this to happen." "You never wanted this to happen?" Richard repeated, his voice rising. "You didn't want to humiliate me? To jeopardize everything I've worked for? To make me the laughingstock of every news outlet in the country?" "Richard, please," Eleanor pleaded, tears brimming in her eyes. "It wasn't like that." "Then tell me, Eleanor," Richard said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What was it like? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you were sleeping with my campaign manager while I was out there fighting for our future." Eleanor's shoulders sagged. "You were always fighting for your future, Richard. Never ours. Never mine." Richard's jaw tightened, his anger momentarily replaced by something colder. Contempt. "Don't you dare try to turn this around on me." The door burst open, and Liam strode in, his expression resolute. "This isn't her fault." Richard turned on him, his fury redirecting like a lightning strike. I trusted you. I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me." Liam held his ground, his voice steady. "I made a mistake, and I take full responsibility for it. But this is bigger than us. The blackmail, the leaks, this isn't just about your campaign, Richard. Someone wanted to destroy you, and they used us to do it." Richard's eyes narrowed, his hands clenched into fists. "You expect me to believe this was some grand conspiracy?" "It's the truth," Liam said firmly. "And if we don't deal with it, it's going to get worse." Richard turned back to Eleanor, his face hard. "Do you have any idea what you've done? To me? To our family?" Eleanor met his gaze, her voice trembling. "I didn't plan this, Richard. But I won't stand here and pretend that I didn't feel invisible in our marriage. That I didn't feel like a prop in your campaign." "Then you should have left," Richard shot back. "Not dragged us all down with you." Hours later, as Eleanor sat alone in her hotel room, the weight of the fallout finally settled on her. The media storm was relentless. The phone calls from friends and family were painful, and Richard had made it clear that their marriage was over in every way but legally. Liam called her, his voice apologetic but resolute. "I'll step down," he said. "It's the only way to stop the bleeding." "And then what?" Eleanor asked, her voice hollow. "Then I disappear," Liam replied. "And you figure out what you want from here." Eleanor didn't respond, her tears falling silently. She had risked everything for a connection she couldn't deny, and now she was left with nothing but the wreckage. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed in her now silent hotel room, her phone clutched tightly in her hands. Liam's voice echoed in her mind from their last conversation. "I'll disappear, and you figure out what you want from here." What she wanted didn't matter anymore. The fallout of their affair had spiraled beyond her control, and Liam stepping down from the campaign was just the beginning of the end. 2 days later, Eleanor met Liam in a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. They had agreed to meet privately, away from the prying eyes of the media and the campaign staff. Liam was already seated at a corner table when she arrived. His shirt sleeves rolled up, his usual confidence dimmed. He looked up as she approached, offering a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thanks for coming," he said as she slid into the seat across from him. Eleanor folded her hands on the table, her heart heavy. "We needed to talk." Liam nodded, leaning back in his chair. "I'll be out of the campaign by tomorrow. I've already spoken to Richard and the staff. It's done." Eleanor's throat tightened. "And then what?" "I leave," Liam said simply. "I've got some contacts in another state. I'll find something else. Start over." Eleanor frowned, her emotions swirling. "You don't have to do this. We could." "Eleanor," Liam interrupted gently, his voice steady. "You know we can't. Not anymore. It's too late." Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them back. "I didn't want it to end like this." "Neither did I," Liam admitted, his voice softening. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "But this was never going to be easy, and now it's too messy. Too much has happened." Eleanor looked down at their joined hands, her chest tightening. "So that's it? After everything, we just walk away?" Liam hesitated before speaking. "I love you, Eleanor. I meant every word I ever said to you. But sometimes, love isn't enough to fix what's broken." Eleanor's tears slipped free, and she pulled her hand away, wiping her eyes. "I wish things were different." "So do I," Liam said quietly. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. When Eleanor returned to the hotel, she found Richard waiting in the sitting area of their suite. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable. "Is it over?" he asked, his tone clipped. "Yes," Eleanor said, her voice barely audible. "It's over." Richard nodded, standing. "Good. The legal team will contact you tomorrow. We'll make this as quiet as possible, for the sake of the children and the campaign. But this marriage is done." Eleanor felt the finality of his words like a physical blow. "I understand." Richard looked at her for a moment longer, his face void of emotion, before he walked out the door. That night, Eleanor lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She had lost everything: her marriage, her lover, and the carefully curated life she had once thought was unshakable. The silence of the room was suffocating, the weight of her choices pressing down on her chest. But beneath the grief and the guilt, there was a faint, flickering sense of clarity. For the first time in years, Eleanor wasn't pretending. She wasn't playing a role or living by anyone else's expectations. And while the road ahead seemed impossibly lonely, it was hers to walk. The courtroom was cold, its walls sterile and unfeeling, as Eleanor sat at the defendant's table. She stared straight ahead, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, doing her best to project an air of composure. Across the room, Richard sat flanked by his legal team, his posture stiff and his expression unreadable. The divorce proceedings had been swift, but not without cruelty. Richard's lawyers had combed through every aspect of Eleanor's life, using her affair with Liam as a weapon to dismantle her reputation. Every photo, every email, every whisper of impropriety had been dragged into the light, painting her as reckless, selfish, and unfit as a wife and mother. Eleanor's lawyer leaned in, whispering, "Stay calm. We'll argue the financial terms in a moment." But Eleanor barely heard her. Her thoughts were consumed by the steady drumbeat of loss that had defined the past few weeks. Richard's testimony was devastatingly measured. He spoke of betrayal, of the damage to his campaign and their family's reputation. His words were calculated, designed to elicit sympathy from the judge and contempt for Eleanor. When it was her turn to speak, Eleanor stood, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the table. "I made mistakes," she began, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. Mistakes that hurt my family, my husband, and myself. But those mistakes don't define who I am. Her gaze shifted to Richard, who watched her with an unreadable expression. I supported Richard through every phase of his career, often at the expense of my own happiness and identity. I won't deny my faults, but I won't allow my entire life to be reduced to one chapter of poor choices. The courtroom was silent as she returned to her seat, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The final ruling came swiftly and decisively. Richard was granted full custody of their 2 children, with Eleanor allowed only supervised visitation. Financially, she was left with a modest settlement, barely enough to sustain her. The judge's decision was clear. Eleanor's actions had consequences, and those consequences would follow her for years to come. Richard left the courtroom without a word, his legal team trailing behind him. Eleanor sat alone for a long moment, the reality of her situation settling over her like a heavy blanket. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor moved into a small apartment on the edge of the city. The space was sparse and unfamiliar, a far cry from the luxury she had once known. She took a job at a nonprofit, working quietly and anonymously, trying to rebuild her life one piece at a time. Her children refused her calls at first, their anger and confusion a painful reminder of what she had lost. But Eleanor didn't give up. She wrote letters, attended counseling, and showed up to every scheduled visitation, determined to prove that she was still their mother, despite everything. Months later, Eleanor found herself standing in a park, watching from a distance as Richard played with their children. The sight was bittersweet, a reminder of the family she had once been a part of. But as she turned to leave, she felt a strange sense of peace. She had made mistakes, terrible, irrevocable mistakes, but she had also found a sliver of truth in the wreckage. She was no longer bound by the expectations of her marriage or the suffocating role of being the perfect politician's wife. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt free. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, but it was hers. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.